Imagine riding hard across open desert, the sun hammering your neck, the dust so thick you can barely see the horse in front of you. You are 12 years old. You do not know where your family is. You do not know if you will survive the next hour. And the men around you, the men you now call brothers, are riding straight into a fight they may not walk away from. That is where Herman Lehmann found himself on a scorching morning somewhere deep in West Texas. A German farm boy who had been ripped from his world, reshaped by fire and hardship into something he never expected to become. And what he witnessed over the next several years would be one of the most extraordinary and forgotten chapters in the entire history of the American frontier. But here is the part most history books skip entirely. The conflict that defined his life was not between settlers and Native Americans. It was between two of the most ferocious warrior nations the continent had ever produced, and the outcome of their war would reshape the entire Southwest. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I am your host, Dustin, and today we are going into the brutal, blood-soaked, and surprisingly human story of the Apache and the Comanche. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because this one is going to go deep. To understand Herman Layman, you have to understand the world he was thrown into. And to understand that world, you have to go back nearly 2 centuries before the day he was taken. The Apache were one of the original powers of the Southern Plains. Long before Texas was Texas, before Mexico, the Apache hunted buffalo across the wide-open grasslands, harvested from pecan groves, and controlled vast stretches of territory from what we now call the Texas Hill Country, all the way down toward the Rio Grande. They were feared, respected, and deeply rooted in the land they called home. Then, sometime around the early 1700s, something happened that changed everything. The Comanche came down from the north. And here is what makes the Comanche different from nearly every other group in this story. When they first encountered the horse, brought to the Americas by Spanish colonizers, they did not simply adopt it, they mastered it. In a matter of decades, the Comanche became arguably the finest light cavalry on the face of the earth. Riders so skilled, so fast, so lethal on horseback that they terrified seasoned soldiers and hardened frontiersmen alike. The Comanche warrior on horseback was not just a man on a horse. He was a weapon system, and the southern plains were his battlefield. When that force turned southward toward Apache territory, the result was catastrophic. The Comanche campaign against the Apache was not a series of skirmishes. It was a sustained generational war of displacement. Raids did not just target warriors. They swept through villages, taking horses, burning crops, destroying the infrastructure that Apache communities depended on to survive through harsh winters. Women faced horrors that history has largely chosen not to document in detail. Children were seized, and those who were kept faced brutal integration into Comanche life. The elderly and the very young rarely survived the retreats. The Lipan Apache, the Mescalero Apache, those who had called the Southern Plains home for generations, were pushed hard and pushed fast. Within a few decades, they had been driven out of central and southern Texas almost entirely, forced westward into rockier, drier, less abundant land where survival was a daily negotiation with a hostile environment. So when you try to understand the world Herman Lehmann entered in 1870, understand this. The Apache he joined were not a people at their peak. They were a people who had already survived a century of warfare, displacement, and loss, and they were still fighting. Now, let us talk about the day a German farm boy's life ended, and an Apache warrior's life began. May 16, 1870, the Lehman family farm in Loyal Valley, Texas. Herman was 12 years old, and he and his younger siblings were out in the wheat fields, doing what farm children did, trying to keep birds from eating the crop. It was an ordinary morning in a hard but ordinary life. Then the Apache arrived. What followed was chaos, the kind of chaos that happens when violence erupts in a place built for quiet work. Herman and his 8-year-old brother, Willie, were seized. Willie eventually managed to escape. Herman did not. He was taken west, into the desert, into a world so different from the German-speaking farmstead he had grown up on that it might as well have been another planet. He was given to Chief Carnoviste, a village leader who became his adopted father. And here is the part that is easy to miss if you read the history too quickly. Herman was not immediately accepted. He was not celebrated. He was given a name, Enda, which translates roughly to white boy, a constant reminder that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he trained, some part of his identity remained foreign to the people around him. But Herman was stubborn, and he was smart. And the Apache, whatever hardships they imposed on their captive, were also extraordinary teachers. He learned to ride in a way that no German farm boy could have imagined. Low and fast and intuitive, reading the animal beneath him the way you read a sentence. He learned to track across rocky terrain, where most men would see nothing, to find water in a landscape that appeared to offer none, to move silently through country that punished noise. He learned the languages of the Apache, their customs, their rituals, their way of seeing the world. He learned what it meant to eat a raw liver on the trail, because cooking a fire could give away your position to people who wanted you dead. And he learned to live with the constant, ever-present threat of the Comanche. Now, here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. The Apache and the Comanche did not just hate each other the way neighboring communities sometimes develop grudges over territory or resources. This was something deeper, something almost mythological in its intensity. The Comanche called the Mescalero and Lipan Apache by a word that translates to gray excrement. The Apache called the Comanche Indeni, derived from a word meaning enemy. These were not diplomatic insults. These were the words two peoples used to describe a relationship that had lasted nearly 100 years and left rivers of carnage on both sides. So when Herman, riding with a young Apache friend named Bobo, came over a ridge one morning, thinking they were safely west of Comanche territory, and heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. You understand exactly what that sound meant. It meant run. Bobo had a good horse. Fast, trained, responsive. He wheeled and went. Herman had a mule. Now I want you to picture this. A 12-year-old, well, he was older by this point, a teenage boy, who has survived years of Apache life, who has become genuinely skilled and hardened by that life, suddenly dependent on the single worst animal for this situation. Because the mule did not run. The mule spun in circles, tight, panicked, aimless circles. While Comanche warriors were closing the distance on the horizon, Herman screamed for Bobo to help. Bobo kept riding. Then a Comanche arrow struck the mule in the hip, and the mule ran faster than Herman had ever seen it move. It tore through the Apache camp, scattering people, knocking over whatever was in its path, heading for the horse herd at the edge of the village. Herman jumped off, grabbed another horse, and rode back to where the fight was already beginning. He scanned the chaos for Bobo. He found him on the ground outside the village, the arrow still in him, his scalp taken. The boy who had ridden out with Herman that morning was gone. And what happened next is one of those moments that tells you everything about who Herman Lehmann had become. He did not retreat. He did not hide. He joined the Apache warriors, pushing back against the Comanche. Grief turned outward into something colder and more dangerous. He fought. But here is the question I want you to hold on to as we move deeper into this story. When a war has been going on for 100 years, when both sides have lost people they loved, when the cycle of raid and revenge and counter-raid has ground whole generations into dust, is there any possible exit, or does it just keep going until one side is gone? We are going to find out. The battle that day was brutal and extended. The Apache outnumbered the Comanche force that attacked, and they knew this ground. The fighting started around 10 in the morning and continued until the sun began to drop. When the Comanche finally withdrew, they left a significant number of their own behind. But the Apache losses were severe. 20 warriors were gone. 8 more were badly enough wounded that 4 of them would not survive the night, and a 5th perished the following day. Those who had fallen were buried with proper ceremony. The Comanche bodies were left where they lay for scavengers, a deliberate statement of contempt that both sides practiced toward each other. Herman participated in collecting weapons from the field, firearms, bows, arrows, shields, things that were worth more than gold in this world. Every weapon recovered was a weapon that could be used in the next fight. Then the survivors packed up and moved, because in Apache life, staying in one place after a major confrontation was not grief. It was a death sentence. Scouts were sent out ahead. They found two Comanche watching the column from a distance. One did not survive the encounter. The other was taken captive. What happened to that captive is, by 21st century standards, deeply disturbing. By the standards of this war, it was not unusual. Herman himself recorded it in his memoir, 9 years among the Indians, without flinching, because flinching was not something the world he lived in rewarded. But there is a moment in that grim episode that Herman clearly never forgot, and that I think tells you something true about human nature. An older Apache man, a woman actually, who had herself been disfigured by violence in a previous encounter, approached the captive Comanche in secret and cut him down, let him go. In the middle of a 100-year war, in the aftermath of a battle that had just taken dozens of lives, one person looked at an enemy and saw something other than an enemy. We do not know what happened to that Comanche afterward. We do not know what happened to the old woman for her act, but Herman remembered it. The Apache moved northwest, putting distance between themselves and the site of the battle. They made camp near a spring, roughly 60 miles from their previous position. For a few days, there was something like stillness. Then an elderly Apache man had a dream. He dreamed of a massive Comanche force coming for them. He brought it to Carnoviste. The village elders gathered and deliberated through the day, without eating or drinking. A council conducted the way serious decisions were always made among the Apache, with full commitment and no shortcuts. They decided to move again. And here is where you have to appreciate the cruelty of timing. After covering 20 miles, some in the group began to doubt. Maybe the old man had just been tired. Maybe the dream was nothing more than fear given a night story. Maybe they were overreacting, pushing women and children and exhausted warriors through hard country based on one person's nightmare. Maybe they should stop, rest, reconsider. They were still debating it when the Comanche appeared. Not a raiding party, not a scouting force. Dozens of warriors, materializing from the terrain the way the Comanche always did, as if the land itself had generated them. The Apache fought back hard, but this time, the numbers and the position were wrong. In minutes, the small Apache band had lost 40 warriors. Most of the women and children were taken captive. Every horse, every piece of food and equipment, everything they had packed and carried through the desert was gone. Approximately 100 Apache warriors and 6 women survived, on foot, in open country, with Comanche territory between them and any kind of safety. They walked for a month. Herman walked with them, through country that offered almost nothing, surviving on whatever they could find, driven by the particular kind of stubbornness that keeps people moving, when every reasonable calculation says to stop. And when they finally made contact with other Apache bands and shared what had happened, something shifted. Word went out across Apache territory. A call to gather at a dry lake bed known to bands across the entire region. Warriors arrived from Utah, Arizona, Mexico. From every direction the Apache world extended. The camp that formed was unlike anything most of those present had ever seen. Men made arrows, hardened spear tips, cleaned and checked rifles, reinforced shields. Women and children drilled in weapon handling and practiced escape routes, because everyone understood that what was coming was not another raid. It was a reckoning. The Apache had reached a collective decision. They could no longer absorb what the Comanche were doing to them. The option to coexist, to find some balance of territory and mutual avoidance, had apparently run out. There were leaders at that gathering whose names resonate through the entire history of this era. Victorio, Geronimo, Carnoviste, men who represented different ideas about how to survive, how to resist, how to endure. Tell me, when you look at a people who have spent a century being pushed from their homeland, and they finally gather every warrior they can reach and decide that enough is enough, how do you feel about that decision? I am genuinely asking. Let me know in the comments, because I think this moment is more complicated than it first appears. Victorio was asked to lead a scouting party westward, to find the Comanche position, and assess what they were dealing with, before the full force committed to an attack. He rode out with a group of trusted men. Days passed. More Apache continued to arrive. The camp grew. The tension grew with it. Then Victorio came back, alone, barely in his saddle. Every man who had ridden out with him had been taken by the Comanche. He had survived, and he had seen what was out there. And what he had seen had changed his thinking in a way that nobody in that camp expected. Victorio stood before the gathered leaders and said something that required genuine courage to say in that moment, surrounded by warriors who had come specifically to fight. He said they should make peace with the Comanche, not because the Apache had lost their nerve, not because the Comanche did not deserve to be fought, but because there was a larger war coming, one that both nations were already losing. And fighting each other was exactly what the people pressing in from every direction needed them to do. The Comanche were being supplied with guns and ammunition by the same forces that were squeezing Apache territory. Every Apache warrior who fell in this intertribal war was one fewer warrior available to resist the displacement that was already well underway. Another chief named Red Wasp, Dick agreed strongly. He laid out the grievances against the outsiders, the encroachment on hunting grounds, the diseases, the broken arrangements, the steady erosion of everything the Apache world had been built on. He wanted to fight the Comanche now and deal with the other problem after. The debate was real, and it was not easily resolved. But in the end, the decision was made to try for a truce. The next morning, the Apache sent riders toward the Comanche camp carrying a white flag. A Comanche warrior came out to meet them, riding in a wide circle at a safe distance, waving a black shield. That was not a greeting. That was a challenge, a declaration that the Comanche were ready to fight and expected the Apache to respond in kind. The Apache rider carried the white flag and kept carrying it. That moment of restraint, in a context where 100 years of mutual violence was pressing from every direction, was one of the most consequential choices in this entire story. The Comanche warrior circled again. The white flag did not change. Eventually, 6 Comanche riders came out to meet 6 Apache representatives in the open ground between the two camps. A conversation began that nobody could have predicted. When that morning started, the Comanche put forward a condition. They wanted the Apache responsible for mistreating Comanche captives handed over for justice. They were referring to Carnoviste, Herman's adopted father, who was very much alive. The Apache representatives told them that the man responsible had perished in the earlier fighting. It was not true, but it was what kept the conversation alive. The Comanche, perhaps sensing that the truth of the matter was less important than the possibility of what peace could actually mean, accepted the answer. A truce was formalized. The women and children taken captive in the ambush were returned to their families. There were tears, real ones, the kind that happen when people who expected to never see each other again suddenly do. Some Apache women chose, or were expected, to remain with Comanche families as a gesture of alliance. Whether that choice was fully free is a question history cannot cleanly answer, but it sealed something between the two nations that had not existed for nearly 100 years. The old woman who had freed the captive Comanche warrior, she went with the departing Comanche. Herman noted her departure without much emotion. He had lived too much by then to be surprised by where people ended up. Herman later credited Victorio specifically for what happened that day. Not just for surviving the scouting mission, not just for having the vision to see beyond the immediate war, but for standing up in front of people who wanted to fight and saying something harder than any battle cry: peace, even with people you have every reason to hate, even with people who have earned your hatred across generations. The plan for a united Apache and Comanche resistance against the encroaching outside world, the thing Victorio had argued for, never fully materialized. History moved too fast, and in directions neither nation could control. But the conflict between the Apache and the Comanche, the century-long war of displacement and revenge, effectively ended in that negotiation between two groups of riders on an open desert plain. Herman stayed with his Apache family for 6 years total. His exit from that life was as violent and unexpected as his entrance. He took a life to avenge Carnoviste, a choice that resulted in his exile from the band. He spent a year alone in the wilderness, between the Pecos and Rio Grande rivers, a period that sounds like a story in itself. Eventually, necessity and loneliness drove him to approach a Comanche band, the same people the Apache had just made peace with, and tell them who he was. They welcomed him. They gave him a new name, Montesa, a German farm boy from Loyal Valley, Texas, adopted Apache warrior. Eventually, temporary Comanche, Herman Lehmann had become something that the frontier, in all its chaos and violence and complexity, had accidentally made possible. A man who existed across the lines that everyone else treated as permanent. So here is the thing I want to leave you with. We tend to talk about the conflicts of the American frontier as a collision between two worlds, settlers and Native Americans. That frame is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because inside the Native American world, there were entire wars being fought, entire civilizations rising and falling, entire centuries of history that unfolded with the same complexity and consequence as anything happening in Washington, or Mexico City, or London. The Comanche did to the Apache what empires do to each other. They expanded, they displaced, they reshaped the map according to their own strength and vision. And then they, too, faced forces they could not outmaneuver, forces that did not care about their extraordinary horsemanship, their military genius, their deeply rooted culture, forces that simply wanted the land. What Victorio understood, standing in that desert camp, surrounded by warriors, ready for a fight that would have served someone else's interests, was that the real war was not the one in front of him. It was the one closing in from every direction. Whether that understanding came too late, whether the truce between Apache and Comanche actually changed anything in the long run, is a question that honest history has to sit with in some discomfort. Herman Lehmann eventually returned to white American society. He wrote a memoir. He was interviewed by ethnographers. He lived long enough to see the world that had taken him in become something unrecognizable. He lived until 1932. He never fully belonged to any of the worlds he had passed through. The farm boy was gone. The Apache warrior was gone. The Comanche newcomer was a season, not a life. What remained was something harder to name. A man who had seen the frontier from the inside, from multiple insides, and had survived to tell it. Think about what it means to spend 6 years in a world that brands you as the outsider, and still choose to fight for it, still grieve its losses, still feel its victories as your own. Identity is not always born. Sometimes it is forged, under conditions that most of us will never face, out of something harder than blood and something more durable than memory. Do you think Victorio made the right call? Was the truce a masterstroke of strategic thinking, or did it cost the Apache a chance they needed to take? I want to hear your read on this one. Drop it in the comments. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. We are going to follow Herman Layman into the next chapter of his life among the Comanche, and then into the reckoning that was waiting for everyone on the frontier who thought the land could still be saved. I am Dustin. This is Frontier